Hi, in this section we'll be building a soccer ball. Now the reason we're going to do that is because what we need is a soccer ball texture, and we need that to be a spherical wrap, and the reason for that is so that we can add it to our shader effector, so we can wipe from the globe material that we already have, and so that it will end up looking like a soccer ball. So I thought the easiest way to do that would also show you a method of baking textures. So what we're going to do is we're going to model a basic soccer ball using primitives and a little tiny bit of modeling, add some textures to it, and then we're going to take that soccer ball and render it out as a bitmap, and then we can use that bitmap on our globe to affect the shader effector and finally the visibility of our clones. So let's dive straight in and get started on this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in what's called a platonic object. With the platonic object we have certain properties in our attributes, and one of these is type, and in here we can select buckyball. And as you can see, we already have a very basic football shape. Now at the moment it's parametric, so if we press the C key on the keyboard, it converts this to a polygon object. We can switch to polygon mode, and now as we roll over we can see certain polygons highlighted. Now we have this set up as polygons. I'm going to switch to my live selection tool, and I'm just going to go through and hold shift down and select certain sets of polygons, the kind of pentagon shape sections, and I'm just going to rotate around. You can actually use 3 on the keyboard if you wish to rotate. 1, 2 and 3 will move, zoom, and 3 will rotate. If you're modeling, it's a good idea to get used to these kind of shortcuts. It just makes it a little bit quicker. If you have a scroll wheel, you can actually use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out as well. Okay, so the idea here is to select the pentagons, and we can make these black. So how are we getting on now? Have we got them all yet? I'm sure I've missed one. Okay, maybe not. It looks like I have included them all. Okay, cool stuff. So now we have those all included. I'm just going to come up and choose Edit, Frame Default to reset my view so that I'm not kind of upside down around the back, and come to the selection menu and choose Set Selection, and you can see that this adds a tag after our platonic, which is a polygon section, and we can give that a name if we wish. Don't really need to in this example. Next thing I'm going to do is create a new material by double clicking in the material manager. Let's just call this black, and for the black color I'm just going to switch off all the channels. Let's make another material and let's call this white. For the white material I'm going to switch off everything except for the luminance channel, and in the luminance channel I'm just going to leave it set on white. So we have a pure white and a pure black. None of this will be affected by any lights or any shading. If we drag the white onto our platonic first of all, and then with the polygon selection, there's several ways of doing this. We can drag the black material onto the platonic, and then in our texture tag we have a selection field here. We can then drag the polygon selection down. Okay, that's a kind of slow way of doing it, and you can see we almost have a sort of football shape now. If we just undo, let's just delete the tag, let's delete our polygon selection tag. If you just selected these polygons and you wanted to add a material just to that selection, there's a quick way of doing that, and what you can do is you can just drag your material and just drag it straight onto the actual selected polygons. And you can see that here it's created a polygon selection tag for us, and it's added the material and dragged that polygon selection into the selection field. So rather than making the selection, choosing selection, set selection, dragging the material onto the object, dragging the selection tag down, the quick way is just to drag your material straight onto the selected polygons, and it does it all for you. If we hit render now, you can see that that's worked fine. Okay, at the moment it's not looking too much like a football. I think for a graphical point of view it would look good if we could see the lines between the black areas joining up. So to do that, what we could do is we could choose Command A to select all the polygons. And then what we can do is we can do what's called an inner extrude, and this will extrude these selected polygons in a planar kind of fashion. So instead of them actually extruding kind of outwards or inwards, they'll stay on the same level, and it'll almost be as if they're scaling down. But they won't actually be scaling down because they'll be creating a border all the way around, and this should hopefully create a border that will give us a line between all our black areas. So the way that we do that is we can press I for the inner extrude tool, or we can come to the structure menu and choose extrude inner. Okay, so press I and we come up with the parameters for this tool, and then we can literally just drag in the viewport, and you can see that the offset parameter here is actually adjusting, but we're not seeing any effect on our object. Let's just undo, press space for our live select. If we just select 2 polygons and press I for inner extrude, and now we drag it, you can see that it's working. So why wasn't it working before? Let's just undo a couple of times to come back to our full selection. The reason it wasn't working is because of the maximum angle. The great thing with most modelling tools in Cinema 4D are they are interactive. So what we can do here is we can hit apply, and we can then scrub our maximum angle. And as we pull this down, you can see that we reach a threshold, and at that point the actual inner extrude becomes visible, because our maximum angle between these faces must be between 39 or 38 and 37. This is where we see the effect of the inner extrude. So now we can adjust our offset, and we can create a line in between. You can see that here preserve groups is actually checked, and what that means is that these groups are being kept together. So there's 2 polygons here, and we're not getting an inner extrude between them. If we didn't have preserve groups checked, then each individual polygon would be inner extruded on its own, and the groups are kind of defined by areas of flatness on your mesh. So I think that looks okay. So how do we make that black as well? We already have a selection set. So what we need to do is basically keep the current selection set that we have and add this to it. However, we don't want to be adding the currently selected polygons to our polygon selection. We want to add the unselected polygons, so we essentially need to invert our selection. Now we could come to the selection menu up here and we choose invert. Alternatively, we could use the keyboard shortcut. Now this is something I haven't discussed before, but as you can see at the end of a lot of the commands in the menus, we have these combinations of letters. On some of them it's just things like Command C, Command X. Several of them have more than one. If it has the kind of M tilde and then another letter, or U tilde and another letter, that means you have to press both letters. And the good thing with this is, although they may be a little bit tricky to remember, if you remember M and U, you can just press that letter first of all on the keyboard. So if we press M, and you can see that Cinema comes up with a list. Now you can't actually select from this list, which is a little bit misleading, but it's just there to remind you of what the next letter is for that particular shortcut. So you can press MS for bevel, MT for extrude, for instance. And if we press U, you can see it does the same. So we can see that I is invert. So if we press UI, it does the invert for us. If we press U, we can then easily pick another one of our selection commands. So that's quite a handy little thing to remember if you need to try and remember your keyboard shortcuts. So now we have our polygons selected, we need to add this to our selection set. So if we click our selection set, what we need to do is to select the polygons that we have in there. So we could click restore selection, but as you can see we've now lost the selection we had before. So if I just undo, what we can do is we can hold shift down, press select polygons, and that adds to the selection. So now we have all those polygons selected, and you can see that these in the middle aren't because they still have this blue edge. So with the tag here selected in the object manager, choose selection, set selection, and that will then overwrite the selection that we already had stored in there and create a new one. And as soon as we did that, you could immediately see that it updated the polygon selection used in this material, and now when we render we have our lines between our black sections. So it's starting to look a little bit more like a football. It's looking a bit like a lampshade as well. It's not very round. I'm not sure if it needs to actually be round for the baking of the texture map, but let's have a go at making it slightly more rounded anyway, because I think the results will be slightly more realistic. One way of making it rounder is to use a deformer. So with it selected, we can hold down the Shift key to add a deformer as a child. And if we come to the deformer menu here, we have one called Spherify. You can see that that immediately changes the size of the object, but it hasn't done much for the roundness. With all deformers, you add them either as a child of the object you wish them to deform, or in the same level of hierarchy. So if you had several polygon objects and you wanted to deform them all, you could add them to a null object and then add the deformer into that same null, and that one deformer would affect all of them. So let's just set our radius to 100. Let's also set the strength to 100. Now you can see a slight change in the shape, but it's very minimal. The reason for this is because we don't really have enough subdivisions on our platonic stroke soccer ball. Now what we need to do is we just need to add some more subdivisions in there. At the moment we've got a polygon selection, so if we choose subdivide, which is under the functions menu, here we have subdivide, and you can see the keyboard for that is US. We can also right click actually, and we can choose subdivide in here. So there's quite a few different ways of accessing commands. So let's press US. This brings up the subdivide menu. We have the option to use hypernerb subdivision. I'll show you that in a sec, and subdivision of 1. Now the problem here is if we click OK, you can see it actually subdivided the mesh, but it's only really subdivided the selected part. Now this is built by design. It's so that you can select certain polygons and you can choose subdivide to increase the subdivision on just that selection. We want to increase the subdivision over the whole surface. So let's just undo first of all, and if we switch to our move tool and click, so it deselects all polygons. Alternatively, we could press Command A to select them all. Now we can press US, subdivide. If we click OK now, you can see that it's subdivided everything. If we now switch to our object tool, you can see the deformation taking place, and you can see that it now looks much rounder. Okay, I'm just going to undo that for now, and let's select our platonic and switch to polygon mode. Okay, so we're back to the previous number of subdivisions. If we just come to the subdivision pop-up again, this time let's choose hypernerb subdivide and click OK. Now you can see what happened here is our selection set has changed, and it's done what's known as a hypernerb subdivision, and this is the same as if you added your object to a hypernerb's object. And that's called subdivision surfaces, and what it actually does is it rounds the surface off as it subdivides. We don't want that option, but if you do need to subdivide as if you were putting it in a hypernerbs, then that's the way to do it. So let's just finally open up the subdivide again, deselect hypernerbs and click OK. Come to our model tool, and you can then see the deformation taking place. If we deselect, or enable and disable should I say, the Spherify deformer, we can see the difference. Now it certainly isn't smooth enough if we were going to be using this as an object, and this is what we were going to be seeing, but I think for using it as an object to just create a texture map from, it should be fine. Now the way that we're going to create a texture map, we could try to bake the texture from here, but I want it to be perfectly spherical, and the way I'm going to do that is I'm actually going to use a sphere. So first of all I'm going to select my platonic object, press the T for scale, and I'm just going to scale this so it's much bigger. Let's scale it up so we're right inside. Okay, so it's pretty big now. If we open up our coordinates, you can see that it's kind of 3,000 meters. By the way, control clicking on these parts will fold managers, which is pretty useful for gaining space, and that's why I've had the coordinates hidden there all along. Okay, so now we have a huge soccer ball. I'm going to add in a sphere object, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually reflect the soccer ball on the sphere's surface. So I'm going to add a new material by double clicking. Let's call this reflect. and come to the Basic tab, and let's switch off everything in here except for reflection. If we drag that onto our sphere object and press render, you can see that we now have our soccer ball being reflected in the sphere. So what we want to do is take this reflection and save that out as a bitmap file, whether that be a JPEG or a TIFF or a Photoshop, that doesn't really matter. And the way that we can do that is with a tag. So with the sphere selected, choose Tags, Cinema 4D Tags, Bake Texture. This adds the Bake Texture tag to our object, and it comes up with a whole new set of attributes in the Attribute Manager. Okay, it's probably a good idea to save your scene if you haven't saved it by now. I've already saved mine, but I'm just going to use the Save Incremental to save another version. If we come back to our Texture tag parameters, we have the Basic tab. As with all objects, we have a Tag, Tab, Options, and then Details. So let's just run through these quickly. First of all, let's look at Options. Now in the Options tab, first of all, down here we can choose what we would like to bake. So we can choose colour, luminance, diffusion, bump, etc, etc, etc. What we'd like to do is we'd like to bake the reflection. And the whole point of baking textures is to speed up time. So, for instance, ambient occlusion is a bit of a render hog. If your objects aren't animating, you can use this to bake a single texture and then use that in your diffuse or any other channel instead of using ambient occlusion. Cinema will then load that bitmap and it will be much, much quicker. You can also use it if they're even an animated object, and if you come to the Details tab here, we can specify the kind of frame range that we'd like to bake, and it will bake a separate material for each frame. You can then load that in as if it were a movie and apply that to your object. Okay, so let's come back to the options and just enable reflection. We'd like to only bake reflection in this example. As you can see, you can bake things like shadows, luminance, color, etc, etc. If we come to the tag section, here we can choose file name. Click on this little button here and choose a path, the format that we'd like to save it in, and as you can see we've got pretty much all the same formats that we had in our render settings. We can also have TIFF and QuickTime Movie, which are off the bottom of the capture area. I'm going to leave it as Photoshop for now. A single file. Now the single file option will, if you select more than one in your options, it will save them as a layered Photoshop file or even a flattened file. Color depth, so we can choose 8, 16, 32-bit. We can choose automatic size, or we can set the size ourselves manually. So for this I'm going to set it manually, and I'm going to use 1024 by 512. The reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to bake a spherical map, and it's often been said that they should be kind of twice the width that they are of the height. Super sampling is a form of anti-aliasing, and it's a good idea to probably set that to 1 for this example. On a lot of textures that you're baking, you won't need to change that, and that will increase render times quite considerably, so just be a little bit careful with that. If you set that up to 2 or 3 times, then you're going to increase your render times by sort of 4 or 8 times. It is a bit of a render hog. Pixel border just adds 1 pixel around the edge of your baking. This is to stop any seams occurring at the edge of UVs and things like that. Okay, so I just need to set a path for this, which I've now done, and as you can see I'm saving it in the Making It Look Good 06 folder, 3D text, and I've called it Soccer Ball. If we come back to the options, you can see at the bottom here we have Bake, Stop, Delete, Preview. One thing I will say before we bake this is that you do need to have good UVs for your object. With something like this sphere, it's a parametric object, so the UVs are internal and they're all perfectly fine. But if it's something that you've made, you will need to make sure you don't have overlapping UVs, things like that. Otherwise your baked texture will be pretty useless. So have a play about in body paint and make sure that you've sorted your UVs out before you use the baked texture. In fact, to be honest, baking textures for scenes is quite time consuming, but if you have some very big scenes that are going to be rendered a lot, especially if you're doing animation, then in the long run it will speed up your workflow. If you're changing those materials and textures, then it's definitely going to be a hindrance, but once you are settled on a final texture, then it will make a huge difference. Okay, so now we've set this all up, let's just click bake, and you can see that it starts to do it immediately. We can right click, choose open window, and this will then show us, and we can scale it up, and it will show us the texture that it's baking, and you can see that we now have a spherical map of our soccer reflection. Cool stuff. So that's pretty much all we need to do for this scene. So we can come back to our main scene now, and we can take this texture and we can load it into one of these shader effectors, and hopefully our globe can then be transformed into a football. This is quite a useful technique, using a reflection map. And one of the other options that you might want to consider using this for is for creating HDR reflection maps. As you probably know, within Cinema 4D you can choose Objects, Sky, Create Sky. Now that sky is a high dynamic range, and if you choose to save out a 32-bit file, you can then basically generate HDR files. So you just create a sky, add in a sphere as I have with a reflective material on it, bake the reflective material, and then you will have a flat image of an HDR of your sky, and you can use that as a reflection map in your scenes. So hopefully that's a handy little tip for you too. So I'm just going to save incremental now I've done this, and close this scene. And just to show you how this would work, and this would work with any other kind of texture that you've baked, presumably you have your original object that you baked it from, and I was using a sphere, so here we have a sphere. If I just choose to load an image, and I load my soccer ball reflection, as you can see it's added the word reflection onto the name that I gave it. If we click open, okay, I just haven't saved this, which is why that error popped up. So now you can see we have this, I've added it to our sphere, and there we go. We now have a soccer ball material. Back in our main scene, we need to now bring in our football or soccer ball texture and use it in a similar way that we have with the globe texture to create a soccer ball kind of look on our sphere. So the first thing we can do is just to double click, create a new material, and let's call this soccer ball. And in the color channel, let's just click to add an image, select the soccer ball reflection PSD that we just baked, and there we go. Now we have that, so we can apply it to our sphere, and as you can see that looks correct. Let's just drag it down so it's the other side of our kind of dummy material for now. If we come to the layer browser and unhide our effectors so we can see the shader effectors that we already have, so we have the shader effector globe scale. Let's just control drag this in the object manager and rename this soccer scale. Select our cloner. If we come to the attributes for this cloner and switch to our effectors tab, we can drag the soccer ball shader effector into there as well. There we go. Okay, at the moment if we select this shader effector, the soccer ball, we'll notice in the shading tab that we still have the same texture. This actually just says texture, but you can tell from the small icon here that it's the actual globe texture. To make this easier, let's select this, come to our basic tab, call this texture globe, and let's select the soccer ball texture tab and call this texture soccer ball. The only reason I've done that is just in case we animate any of these, or for instance when we do come to our shader effector shading tab and we can see exactly which texture tag is being used in this field. So for the shader effector globe, we want the texture globe texture tag, and for the soccer shader effector we want to drag in our soccer ball texture. If we just deselect that tag so we can see what's going on here, you can see now what's happened is that we can only actually see the soccer ball texture where the globe was before. This is because both shader effectors are actually having an effect on the clones at the same time. So first of all, the shader effector globe kind of scales down all the clones where the C is, and then the soccer ball scales them down where we have white parts. If we switch off the globe shader effector for now, just so we can see our soccer ball in action, there we go. If we just come to the sphere display tag, and let's just switch off the level of detail for a moment and render. It will take a moment to render, but this should just clarify to us that our soccer shader effector is working correctly. Okay, so that took 25 seconds and it looks pretty good. That's working as expected. So what we need to do now is we need to work out a way to transition from our globe to our soccer ball. I'm going to just select the level of detail in the display tag and just set that to 25% just to speed the scene back up again. Now we know that's working. If we enable our shader effector globe, because that's the one that we want to have working at the beginning, and then what we can do is we can kind of reduce the effect of this shader effector and then use fall off on our soccer ball so that we wipe the soccer ball on. And the best time to do that would be at the time of the transition where it changes from top stories to latest sports, so that would be around here. We already have some keys set up for the rotation of the globe and the camera pulling back, so we can perform the wipe there so everything happens in sync. So let's just move to frame 55 and let's look at setting up the fall off for our soccer shader effector. Okay, so let's work out how we can wipe our soccer texture on. First of all, I'm going to disable the shader effector globe so we can see the full effect of our shader effector soccer, and as you can see we now have our soccer texture over the whole of the sphere. And what I'm going to do is use fall off for this, so let's switch to the fall off tab for the shader effector soccer, come down to shape and choose linear. We can't see any change here, but if we switch to our top view, you can see that at the back of our sphere we have all our clones visible, and at the front we have the soccer ball texture. So this just means that our shader effector is on the wrong orientation. So if we press R for rotation, and let's just rotate this around 90 degrees, like so, come to our front view, and you can see that at the top all the clones are visible, at the bottom it's our soccer material. If I press E and move this up and down, you can see that this works pretty well as a wipe. Let's undo this, come down to the size, and let's just increase the Z fall off to 250 so that we have a slightly larger area for our fall off. Okay, so at frame 55, let's just switch to a side view, zoom out slightly, grab our shader effector and just pull it down just so it's below the sphere totally. Switch to our coordinates tab, let's add a key for Y, let's move to frame 65 and let's pull this up, and we can see the wipe taking place. Oh, a bit too far, somewhere around there. Add another key. Now if we come to our camera view, as we drag through, you can see that wipes on perfectly okay. If we however enable our global effector, our shader effector for the globe, we have the problem that we looked at before. So the football texture is only showing up where the countries were, because the shader effector globe has already kind of scaled down lots of them, and this means that both shader effectors are actually working at the same time. So what we can do is we can reduce the effect of this shader effector as the transition takes place. So let's just jump back to 55, come to our shader effector globe, switch to the effector tab, add a key for strength. Now let's come forward to frame 65 and let's pull that strength down to 0. Add another key. So when we come back to this point here, you can see that we have our globe effect, and as we transition through, we now have our soccer ball effect. So that's working pretty cool. At this point here, the shader effector globe doesn't really have any effect on the scene, and there's no point in it actually being enabled anymore. So we could optimize our scene a little bit more, and we could animate the enabled switch. Now that corresponds to this red cross and green tick, and if we switch to the basic tab, let's just pull this up, you can see here we have an enabled checkbox. If I uncheck that, you can see that it affects this icon here, and it's affecting the enabled state of that object. So at this point in time, when our effector strength is 0, we can disable this. So let's disable this and add a key, but we want it to be enabled for the rest of the scene beforehand. So let's just jump to the very beginning, enable, and add a key. And what that means is that this shader effector will stay enabled until we get past frame 65, and then it will disable. We can actually do the same for the shader effector soccer. We don't need that to be calculated at all until frame 55, where the wipe is performed. So at frame 55, we'd like this shader effector to become enabled. So let's add a key here, and if we jump to the beginning of the scene, we can disable it up until that point. So let's disable it and add another key. It's not essential to do this, but that will optimize your scene. If you have got hundreds of objects in your scene and they're all enabled at all time, then Cinema 4D has a lot more calculations to do. If you can enable and disable objects as and when they're needed, it will speed up your workflow. I think that it's looking a little bit drab and we're getting quite far with the project. It might be a good idea now to add in some materials just to make it look a little bit more interesting. If it was a real job at this point, it possibly could be sent to a client just to see if that's ready for approval. So adding some materials will make a world of difference. So that's what we're going to do in the next part of the class. We're going to add in some new materials. We're going to look at using Lumus for some anisotropic highlights, using the Fresnel shader, adding in some high dynamic reflections, and we'll also have a look at a small introduction to the compositing tag and how that can help us restrict things like reflections, stuff like that. So, hope you enjoyed that part, and I'll see you in the next section.